Ein was born an appraiser of no worth, a fate that condemned him to a life of endless hardship. He struggles to make ends meet and is constantly treated like a doormat by those around him. Now, standing at the brink of despair, he figures there's only one way to escape, taking the plunge and putting an end to it all. A few hours prior, Ein had joined a party with Jolene, a mage, and Zoid, a swordsman. They were battling a rat the size of your typical New York alley monster. Ein managed to land a strike, but it wasn't enough to finish the creature off. Frustrated, he shouted for Jolene to hurry up with her spell. When she finally completed it, she unleashed a blast, instantly killing the rat. With the fight over, Zoid and Jolene showered each other with praise for a job well done. However, their treatment of the appraiser was anything but kind. Zoid snapped at Ein to hurry up and do his part, but the heavy load on his back, coupled with the weight of their constant ridicule, made it difficult to move. He stumbled and landed face first in the dirt. Clearly, he was being abused, but he had no choice but to pick himself up and perform his duties like an obedient servant. At birth, every person in this world is granted a job by the goddess of light and a set of skills by the goddess of darkness. By refining these skills, one can develop various abilities and powers. However, jobs are inherited through bloodlines and can never be altered. They are ranked into tiers: rare, high, common, and low common. As expected, low common is seen as bottom tier garbage, leaving those stuck with it fated to live as peasants or merchants. Ein's parents once ran a small appraisal shop to sustain their family, but both of his parents met a tragic end when Ein was still a child, leaving him to fend for himself. That's how he ended up as an unappreciated pack mule for these two. And while he despises working under them, he doesn't have a choice. Using his appraisal skill on the rat they just killed, he confirms that it's an F-rank creature, essentially worthless. However, its tooth is a D-rank material, making it valuable enough to salvage. He attempts to pry the rat's mouth open to extract it, but its jaw is surprisingly tough, making the process slow and frustrating. Zoid and Jolene grow impatient as Ein struggles, and when he asks them for a little help to speed things up, Zoid acts like he just uttered blasphemy. Outraged that Ein would even think of requesting assistance, he hurls a rock at him and calls him worthless. Ein glares at Zoid, his eyes burning with fury over the abuse. But rage alone isn't enough. Without strength to back it up, he's nothing. Zoid simply kicks him across the ground, forcing Ein to swallow his pride, apologize, and beg for mercy. Losing interest in beating him further, Zoid lets it go, and Ein resumes his struggle to pry open the rat's jaw while Jolene and Zoid continue mocking him, laughing at how he's nothing more than a filthy scavenger. They clearly enjoy putting him down, knowing full well he can't do anything about it. After all, there's no real work for an appraiser like him. If anyone needs an item evaluated, they can simply go to the guild and use a magic tool for an instant appraisal. Low-tier appraisers like Ein are completely obsolete. Ein hears every cruel word they say about him, and the worst part is he knows they're right. His skill is practically useless, leaving him with no choice but to scrape together a miserable existence, scavenging monster parts for arrogant fools like Jolene and Zoid. The moment Ein tucks the tooth into his bag, Zoid makes sure to remind him why they even bother letting him tag along. It's not out of generosity. It's simply because Zoid can't stand touching disgusting things like that himself. So Ein had better remember his place and keep playing the role of their obedient little garbage collector. Life dealt Ein a terrible hand, but he has no choice but to endure it. If suffering at the hands of these two is what it takes to survive, then so be it. As they make their way deeper into the dungeon, Zoid suddenly spots a hellhound corpse lying smack in the middle of the path. Without a second thought, he takes it as a stroke of pure luck. They can loot it without lifting a finger in battle. Wasting no time, he orders Ein to get to work. But unlike Zoid, Ein actually uses his brain. If this monster was already dead before they arrived, then something strong must have taken it down. And more importantly, hellhounds aren't even supposed to spawn in this section of the dungeon. That alone is a major red flag. Of course, Zoid has no interest in hearing logical arguments from someone he considers a worthless weakling. He cuts Ein off, telling him to shut up and start looting. While Ein begrudgingly does the dirty work, Jolene and Zoid move on to discussing what they plan to do once they're back in town, making sure to throw in some disgusting comments about possibly forcing Ein to watch. But before they can get too deep into their twisted fantasies, they notice something else: a second hellhound corpse further down the corridor. Naturally, they order Ein to retrieve that one too. But this time, Ein can't move. His body is frozen with dread. According to the guild's map, there shouldn't even be a corridor here. Something is seriously off. His instincts scream at him that pressing forward is a terrible idea. Yet, as expected, Zoid doesn't care about what Ein thinks. Ignoring the growing sense of unease, he strides into the corridor without hesitation. And before long, he turns back to sneer at Ein. "If you're that much of a coward, then just stay here and rot." Zoid sneers, telling Ein that if he's too much of a coward, he's free to leave, but he won't be getting paid anymore. After all, refusing an order from the party leader is grounds for immediate dismissal. Ein finds himself completely trapped. On one hand, every instinct is screaming at him that walking into that corridor is a terrible idea. But on the other, if Zoid kicks him out, he's done for. No other party would take in someone with a skill as useless as appraisal. Without this job, he won't have any way to survive. Despite knowing it's a disaster waiting to happen, Ein forces himself to follow Zoid into the corridor. As they make their way deeper, they soon stumble upon a gruesome sight. Dozens of hellhound corpses scattered across the ground. To Zoid, this is the ultimate payday. A fortune in loot just sitting there, ripe for the taking with zero effort required. But Ein isn't celebrating. If something wiped out this many hellhounds, then whatever did it might still be lurking nearby. Zoid, however, is sick of Ein's constant paranoia. Rolling his eyes, he snaps at him to shut up and get to work. But before Ein can respond, his blood runs cold. His eyes widen in terror as he spots something lurking behind Zoid. His trembling finger lifts to point toward it. Zoid, irritated, turns around, only to freeze in place. Dozens of glowing red eyes pierce through the darkness, unblinking and hungry. Within seconds, a pack of hellhounds emerges from the shadows. The realization crashes down on them all at once. The corpses they found earlier weren't some lucky break. They were the aftermath of infighting within the pack. And now, they've walked straight into the rest of them. Ein has no combat abilities. Even if Zoid and Jolene fought together, they'd be lucky to take down just one hellhound, let alone an entire pack. Fighting isn't an option. Their only hope of survival is to run. Zoid quickly realizes that outrunning the hellhounds isn't necessary. They just need to be faster than Ein. With that in mind, he tells Jolene to cast a paralysis spell on their so-called teammate. At first, Jolene is confused, but it doesn't take her long to catch on. Without hesitation, she raises her staff and immobilizes Ein, sending him crashing to the ground, completely unable to move. Lying helpless on the floor, Ein can hardly believe that they would actually abandon him like this. Zoid, ever the liar, assures him that the paralysis won't last long. If he stays quiet, he might just get lucky and slip away unnoticed. But before Ein can even process those words, Zoid deliberately makes a ruckus to draw the hellhound's attention straight to him. With that, the two cowards bolt, leaving Ein to his fate. The beasts waste no time. They pounce, sinking their fangs into his arm and leg, and a sharp scream escapes his throat. But as excruciating as the pain is, it does have one benefit. It jolts his body enough to break the paralysis. With no other option, he grabs a rock and smashes it against the nearest hound, just enough to force them back for a moment. Thinking quickly, he hurls his backpack at them. While the impact does little to hurt them, the scent of food spilling out proves to be just the distraction he needs. Now free for the moment, Ein staggers to his feet and limps toward the exit, only to find it completely blocked off. Zoid and Jolene made sure of that before they fled. Trapped, he has no time to waste. With the hounds already regaining interest in him, he frantically scans his surroundings until his eyes land on another corridor. It's his only shot, so without hesitation, he forces his injured body forward and makes a desperate run for it. To his horror, the corridor he just dashed into leads to nothing but a massive dead end. Panic sets in as the sound of snarling and pounding paws grows closer. With nowhere left to run, Ein realizes that death is inevitable. But if he's going to die anyway, he'd rather throw himself off the edge than be torn apart by those monsters. For years, he blamed his miserable existence on his pathetic appraisal job, believing it doomed him from birth. But standing at death's door, he realizes the truth. He never actually tried to overcome his circumstances. He simply accepted his fate as worthless and let the world trample him. Not that it matters now. Even if he understands his mistakes, it's far too late to change anything. A deafening impact echoes as his body crashes down. But miraculously, instead of meeting instant death, he lands directly atop a tree. A stunning girl appears before him, stepping gracefully toward his lifeless form. Without a word, she leans down and places a gentle kiss on his forehead. The moment she does, his body starts moving again. His wounds close, his pain vanishes, and within moments, his consciousness returns. As Ein blinks back into awareness, the realization dawns on him. He's alive, and every single one of his injuries has been healed. Bewildered, he tries to make sense of the miracle until he notices droplets of water falling from the tree above. He instinctively catches a few and appraises them. What he sees leaves him utterly stunned. These are S-rank droplets from the legendary world tree. He quickly turns his skill toward the enormous tree itself, and sure enough, the results confirm his suspicions. This isn't just any tree. This is the world tree, the mythical source of mana that humanity once relied on to wield magic. According to legend, the world tree withered and perished long ago, sparking centuries of debate among scholars. Some believed it still existed, hidden somewhere beyond reach, fueling endless expeditions in hopes of rediscovering it. But no one ever found it. Then again, who would have thought to look at the bottom of a dungeon? He quickly pieces it together. The tree must have been the reason he came back to life. With a deep breath, he bows his head in gratitude, thanking it for saving him. As soon as he does, he hears a soft voice respond. His head snaps up, but there's no one around. His pulse quickens, but after a moment, he shakes it off. Probably just his imagination. For now, the good news is that he survived the fall, and this place seems monster-free. The bad news? He has no idea how to get back to the surface. Zoid and Jolene definitely aren't going to send help, and there's no food here, meaning he'll starve if he doesn't figure something out soon. With no other option, he sets off toward the exit, but before he leaves, he offers the tree one last word of thanks. Looking at the unexplored terrain ahead, I knows this area isn't on any guild map. That means he has no clue what kinds of creatures lurk here. If those hellhounds nearly killed him, whatever's ahead is bound to be even stronger. He's terrified, but he refuses to make excuses anymore. If he wants to live, he has to push forward, no matter how impossible survival may seem. He walks cautiously through the dungeon, expecting danger at every turn, but strangely, nothing appears. Not a single monster in sight. For a brief moment, relief washes over him. Maybe luck is finally on his side. Then, without warning, a gust of wind rushes past his face. A second later, his ear is on the ground. A sharp, searing pain explodes through his head, and he lets out a scream. Instinctively, he reaches to grab his severed ear, only for two of his fingers to be sliced off next. Panic sets in as blood pours from his wounds, and his wide eyes lock onto the nightmare standing before him. An S-rank gremlin. Even those hellhounds were only B-rank, and they nearly ripped him apart. Against this thing, he has no chance. The gremlin moves like a blur, slashing at him relentlessly. He can't even react. It's too fast, too precise. His only hope is to run. But just as he turns to flee, the gremlin raises its scythe, aiming straight for his chest. Just as it was about to strike, the creature suddenly froze in place, its body trembling as an even more horrifying presence made itself known. Without warning, the gremlin was crushed under the immense weight of a towering death bear. If Ein had no hope against the gremlin, then against this monstrous beast, his chances were non-existent. The bear swiped at Ein's face with razor-sharp claws, tearing through his flesh and leaving him with only one eye. As he desperately tried to drag himself away, the creature snatched him up with its massive paws, squeezing with such force that blood spilled from his mouth. Just as the bear was about to devour him, its massive head was sent flying, severed clean off by an irritable woman. She clearly wasn't thrilled about saving a human, but the persistent pleading of that girl had left her with little alternative. As Ein struggled to comprehend what had just happened, he was stunned to find that, once again, his injuries had vanished without a trace. Sitting up, he spotted the girl from earlier seated across from him. Before he could fully process the situation, a woman suddenly appeared behind him, her tone sharp as she demanded that he express his gratitude and drink the tea that had been prepared for him. Ein was momentarily puzzled. He hadn't noticed any tea, until his eyes landed on Yuri, who was holding a delicate cup in her hands. She had made it just for him. Despite his skepticism, uneasy thoughts crept into his mind. The tea could contain something unpleasant, perhaps even a questionable ingredient. But before he could object, Ursula forced it down his throat, leaving him no room to resist. To his surprise, the flavor was exquisite, and he couldn't help but admit as much. Hearing this, Yuri's face lit up with joy, her happiness shining through. Ein found her expression undeniably endearing, but his thoughts were swiftly interrupted by Ursula's warning. Her voice was ice cold as she made it clear that if he so much as entertained a single improper thought about Yuri, she would erase his very existence. Taking the threat seriously, Ein quickly moved on, shifting the conversation as he turned to them and asked whether they were the ones responsible. Ursula scoffed at the idea of protecting a filthy human like him, making it clear that the only reason she saved him was because Yuri had persistently pleaded for his life. Left with no other choice, she begrudgingly intervened. Ein turned to Yuri with genuine gratitude, thanking her for caring about him. Her face turned slightly red with embarrassment, but before the moment could linger, Ursula swiftly drop-kicked him in the face and proceeded to stomp him into the ground for daring to flirt with her daughter. Shocked, Ein struggled to process what he had just heard. Ursula was Yuri's mother? However, Ursula quickly clarified that she wasn't her biological mother, but rather her guardian, a role she had held ever since Yuri first took root in this place. Despite her human-like appearance, Yuri was no ordinary girl. She was the World Tree, one of 9 sacred beings that existed in this world. Ursula had been entrusted with protecting her, ensuring her safety from any threats. I was stunned to learn that Yuri was actually the spirit of the World Tree, though, in hindsight, her ethereal beauty made it seem fitting. But the second he voiced his thoughts aloud, Yuri became flustered once again, and Ursula immediately responded by knocking him to the ground, furious that he dared to look at Yuri with what she called impure intentions. Apologizing, Ein tried to shift the subject, but that was when he realized something strange. Despite having his eye torn out by the death bear, he could still see. Ursula explained that she had healed him using the tears of the World Tree, but even their miraculous power couldn't regenerate a completely destroyed eyeball. That was when Yuri had stepped in, offering to use a part of the World Tree to create a new eye for him. Ein was deeply grateful yet again, but a thought lingered in his mind. Why did Yuri care so much about him in the first place, considering they had only just met? Yuri smiled softly and told him that it was because he had thanked her when he first fell into this place. It was rare for people to find themselves here, but there had been a few unfortunate incidents in the past. Every time someone fell, Yuri would always save them. To give it his all, knowing that his survival depends on it. Ursula crosses her arms, eyeing him skeptically, before nodding in approval. Good? Because if you slack off even once, I'll personally feed you to the monsters, she declares. Ein can't tell if she's joking or not, but judging by the sharp glint in her eyes, he decides not to take any chances. Meanwhile, Yuri wipes away her tears, a bright smile returning to her face. "Thank you, Ursula. I knew you'd help," she exclaims, beaming with joy. Ursula sighs, mumbling about how she always gets dragged into troublesome situations, but there's a rare gentleness in her expression as she watches Yuri's happiness. Realizing just how much of a miracle this opportunity is, Ein bows his head deeply. "Thank you, both of you. I promise I won't waste this chance," he says, his voice filled with determination. "Good," Ursula responds with a smirk. "Because once we start, you'll be begging me to let you go back to that dungeon." The weight of her words sinks in as Ein gulps, realizing that whatever lies ahead might just be more terrifying than anything he's faced so far. Ein promises to give it his all, but as soon as Ursula leads him outside to begin his training, unease washes over him. He suspects she might throw him straight into combat with monsters. Sure enough, Ursula bluntly states that he'll have to fight them alone, as it's the fastest way to improve. To start, she points out a gremlin in the distance. However, Ein doesn't see anything. Ursula reminds him that his new eye is a fragment of the world tree and encourages him to use it properly. Yet, even with his spirit eye, he still struggles to see. Ursula explains that he simply lacks the awareness of its true potential. Taking a moment, Ein reflects on how he lost his eye and how Yuri restored it. When he opens them again, his vision is much sharper. Now that he can see clearly, Ursula declares that training has officially begun. She throws a rock at the nearby gremlin, instructing Ein to learn how to dodge its high-speed attacks. He doubts it's possible, as the creature moves too fast for him to track. But Ursula tells him to activate his appraisal skill to analyze its movements. Ein doesn't think it will work that way, but with no other options, he tries. And to his amazement, he can now predict the gremlin's actions. Unfortunately, seeing isn't enough if he forgets to dodge. As Ein takes a hit, Ursula casts a barrier and pulls out a vial of tree drops borrowed from Yuri. She pours the liquid over his severed ear, reattaching it. Then, she warns him that he'd better take this training seriously. Then it's obviously going to avoid the strike. Ursula smirks at his failed attempt and tells him that he needs to be smarter than the monster if he wants to land a hit. Ein realizes that simply predicting its movement isn't enough. He has to find a way to trick the gremlin into leaving itself open. Determined to make use of his new weapon, Ein steadies his breathing and focuses on his surroundings. He recalls how Yuri's branch was used to create the sword, reminding himself that he cannot afford to waste her sacrifice. Ursula watches silently as he tightens his grip, strategizing his next move. Instead of aiming directly at the gremlin, he swings in a feint, making it think he's attacking from one angle. As expected, the gremlin jumps to evade, but this time, Ein was ready. The moment it leaps, he adjusts his stance and swiftly slashes upward, catching it midair. The gremlin lets out a pained shriek as his blade connects, cutting deep into its torso. Staggering backward, it glares at him with newfound caution. Ursula nods approvingly, acknowledging that he finally landed a solid hit. However, the fight is far from over. The gremlin, now enraged, begins moving even faster, forcing Ein to push himself even harder to keep up. Sweat drips down his face as he dodges the gremlin's relentless attacks. His muscles ache, but he refuses to back down. This time, instead of reacting purely on instinct, he starts reading the gremlin's patterns. Every creature, no matter how fast, has a rhythm to its movements. After a few more exchanges, he notices a slight hesitation before it lunges. Seizing the opportunity, he plants his feet firmly and swings his sword at just the right moment, striking the gremlin directly in the chest. With a final shriek, the creature collapses to the ground. Ein gasps for breath, his body trembling from exhaustion, but he has done it. Ursula grins and tells him that he's finally passed the second test, though it will require intense focus. Ein is skeptical, but excited by the possibility of acquiring new abilities so easily. Taking a deep breath, he concentrates on the gremlin's movements, attempting to visualize its agility and reflexes as if they were his own. As he focuses, his spirit eye begins to glow faintly, and suddenly, a flood of information surges into his mind. He sees every movement, every instinct, and every bit of experience the gremlin had built over its lifetime. His body tenses for a moment as his brain struggles to process the overwhelming data, but then, just like that, he understands. His muscles feel lighter, his reflexes sharper, as if he had trained for years in evasion and high-speed combat. Ursula smirks, sensing the change in him, and tells him to test it out. Without hesitation, she hurls a rock straight at his head. But this time, Ein doesn't even need to think. His body moves on its own, effortlessly dodging the projectile like it was second nature. His eyes widen in shock, but Ursula simply nods. "Good, you're finally starting to get it," she says. Realizing what just happened, Ein can't help but feel excited. He just gained a skill in an instant, something that would normally take months if not years to master. He grins and clenches his fists, feeling stronger than ever before. But before he can get too carried away, Ursula crosses her arms and reminds him that this was only the beginning. Now that he's proven he can learn new abilities, it's time for the real training to begin. If he truly wants to make it out of this dungeon alive, he's going to need more than just enhanced reflexes. He needs to master combat itself. With that, Ursula declares that the next phase of his training will push him beyond his limits. And if he thought fighting gremlins was tough, he hasn't seen anything yet. Ein decides to give it a shot and appraises the gremlin's skills. Suddenly, a sharp pain shoots through his head as a flood of information overwhelms his mind. He drops to his knees, clutching his skull, but once the intense headache finally fades, he realizes he has acquired the gremlin's high-speed movement skill. It's hard to believe he picked up an ability so quickly, so to test it out, he dashes down the dungeon corridor. The sheer speed at which he moves astounds him. He's much faster than before. However, there's an issue. His body isn't accustomed to handling such velocity, and within seconds, every muscle fiber in his body is utterly shredded. Ursula quickly catches up and pours some of the teardrops over his broken form, healing his injuries. If his body can't endure the strain yet, then he has no choice but to train until he adapts. Each time he sprints, his muscles tear apart, but with Ursula continuously restoring him, he pushes forward again and again. Eventually, his body ceases to break under the pressure. Now equipped with a stronger physique and the acceleration skill, Ein wonders if he might finally stand a chance against the Death Bear. However, Ursula quickly crushes that thought, explaining that while he may be quicker and more agile, he still lacks the attack power necessary to take on such a formidable opponent. To help him grow stronger, Ursula offers to let him copy one of her own abilities. Excited by the prospect, Ein eagerly asks what her skill is, only to be met with a sudden fireball launched straight at him. Her ability, known as Discard Enchant, grants her the power to cast spells instantly without the need for a chant. He expected, and Ein can hardly believe how much stronger he has become. Eager to learn Ursula's ability, Ein is thrilled at the thought of mastering instant magic casting. However, Ursula won't make it easy. She insists he can only appraise her skill while she's actively launching a fireball at him, purely for her own amusement. With no choice but to play along, Ein appraises the incoming attack and successfully learns the Discard Enchant ability, only to be immediately struck by the fireball. He collapses in pain once again, groaning as Ursula heals him. Determined to make the most of his new ability, Ein throws himself into training. But there's a major issue. Since he doesn't possess a magic-based class, his mana reserves are pitifully low, depleting almost instantly whenever he casts a spell. Fortunately, the healing tears not only restore his strength, but also slightly expand his mana capacity each time. If he ever wants to truly master magic, though, he knows he has a long road ahead. After half a month of relentless training, Ein has made significant progress. He can now cast mid-level spells and has reached the point where he can unleash over 1,000 fireballs at once. With his enhanced skills and a significantly improved appraisal ability, Ursula finally deems him strong enough to challenge another Death Bear. Despite his growth, Ein can't shake a slight nervousness at the thought of facing such a powerful monster alone. However, Ursula reassures him that if he utilizes everything he has learned, the battle should be well within his capabilities. As the fight begins, the Death Bear lunges at him with razor-sharp claws. But before it can strike, Ein appraises its attack pattern and swiftly counters with a point-blank windcutter spell. The attack deals significant damage, but it's not enough to take the beast down. Wasting no time, Ein follows up by unleashing a relentless barrage of fireballs, one after another, until the massive creature finally collapses, lifeless. The battle turned out to be far easier than he anticipated, and as he stands over the defeated beast, Ein fully realizes just how much he has grown. Ein had expected a much tougher fight, so he starts to wonder if the Death Bear was always this weak. However, the truth is that he has simply become far stronger than he realizes. This marks the end of the episode. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part.